everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Madison. I hope you're enjoyed this evening. I just want to start by saying thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. We're really great panel this evening talking about AI safety. Let's just start by with your definition for what AI safety is. So it's like either what talk, right? AI is rapidly evolving, as we know, and with any new innovation, then additional risks and challenges to consider. And so when we're exploring AI safety, we're really talking about trying to mitigate potential harms and unintended consequences that come with this rapidly evolving technology. And so really excited to dive into it. And well, then slot. Perfect. All right. So at Appen, we prioritize AI safety for a variety of reasons, right? As everyone should. AI safety for us is about taking care of our customers and building the most reliable and responsible products that we can. So we do have over 25 years of experience helping the world's leading model builders and enterprises to build, train, and evaluate safer AI systems. And so that's our expertise in this area. If you're interested in learning more about the latest research and best practices in AI safety, there's a QR code on the screen that will lead you to our most recent paper on the topic. And I also invite you to connect with other members of our team who are in the audience this evening after our chat. But the QR code will also be on the screen at the end of the talk if you'd like to wait and get your flows out then. It's up to you. But I know you're interested to hear me talk. And so without further ado, I'm excited to introduce you to our panelists this evening. We got to slide in. All right, beautiful. So I'd like to start with just everyone giving a brief introduction of who they are. We can go from the work, huh? Shine, as you can see, you're in the top picture. You're special. I'm physical product manager at Appen. I work on developing innovation for the companies, meaning all the product we develop, we try to incorporate whatever we can from AI to make it practical and valuable, or to make it also safer. But we also have another approach of innovation, which consists in helping our customers to put this innovation with regard to AI or safety into their own product rather than relying on our services.
Yeah, hi. I am Colin Lee. I am a current associate of Berkeley. I do research on personal learning, safety or capability algorithms in the human scenario. That's sort of part of focus by giving more information areas. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Peter Magic. I was also much younger at that photo.
That's just an old photo.
So I'm a partner at Damaris LLP. We're an intellectual property litigation firm with New York, San Francisco, and DC offices. I'm based out here in San Francisco. What we do is handle intellectual property disputes that relate to patent, trade secret, copyright, stuff like that. And so that's where I fit into this AI future and talk more through a bit.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Max. I am the same age in my photo. So I also work with Peter at Damaris doing intellectual property litigation, and part of that I was an intelligence officer in the Army, specializing in signals and cyber avoidance for 10 years, interested in sort of missing disinformation and how that plays out. And happy to be here.
You ever on Q&A? Both ends. Sure. Okay, great. So we'll kick off with a question for each of you, and then we'll just dive into some great discussion questions for the group. So then, let's go first. Your research focuses on AI failures and black swan events. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So actually, this is my first time to triggers by research for right with the black swans, and I'm not sure whether the audience is familiar with it. Is there anyone who's heard about the black swans? Not the movie that Malcolm. Okay. Yeah, I'll be finished and go ahead. So, black swan stars, they're really rare events, but highly. They have really external harvest, for example, like a few years ago, COVID-19 is a black swan, or people who work in economics or economics or risk management and those stuff, people in perspectives, this is a lot of the cases of black swans. The reason that I actually focus on is that nowadays the AI models are getting worse and worse, and people are they're surprised by the its extremely present performance of AI listening. But why those black swans are still unpredictable, even though we have a lots of data and you just have a increasing model size. And in the end, I was sort of focusing on maybe we understand the black swan in the wrong way. We have a complete interpretation understanding of the black swans. And if we does not understand the origin of the event, then we could not call it totally controllable, predictable algorithm, isn't it? So that's the reason why I sort of have to call the paper of the black swan hypothesis. And I'm also given a how the algorithm is encompassed a very large certain statistical turn out. And just the main message is that people think that those black swan events actually happens because of environmental stationarity, which means that if you're in the past, like you're present, but those are that's the great cover that's becomes your future is sort of unpredictable. But one of my hypotheses is that those black swans also happen in a static environment, which is even if your environment is fixed, those events can happen because humans basically have misperceptions on understanding the world. And there's actually two main misunderstandings of the world, which is the first is a rule separation. What I mean is that let's say you have think about the scenarios, which is you gain $100, you lose $100, but if you take an actual value that those are same, but we actually feel that losing is more in the actual. That's what we call the rule separations, and human also perceives the event probability in a wrong way, which is for an event that actually gives you sort of positive outcome, yet people sort of outweights the rare events. Like that's the reason why we are Bible lottery. And for an event that actually gives you a negative reward, and people tends to underrate the probability of the rare event. That's the also reason why we are sort of vulnerable to those like COVID-19 or really negative rare events. So what I have done is that, okay, we have those kind of two irrationalities or two misperceptions, and that's the sort of reason why those black swans can happen. And for my last year, past 2 years, I have focused on how to mathematically model those black swans by human irrationality or human misperceptions, and then sort of focusing on, okay, maybe if that's the case, then we have to sort of rethink about designing the AI safety algorithms, not just predicting those stationarity of the environment, but rather how to correct the human irrationality to better understand the world itself. So yeah, that's the response that's sort of going on, and I might be more talk about the first questions, like those were that's yeah, anyway, that's what I'm starting doing. Yeah. So,
And we get more into the practical applications for how to solve those issues and how to plan ahead for that in a further discussion. But I'd love to pass the mic, or you can pick up your own mic if you'd like to choose your adventure, Mr. Raptic. And tell us a little bit more about, we've heard about risks and the ways that AI systems can be dangerous, small events, things can go wrong. And tell us a little bit more about what the legal landscape looks like for that, and from an intellectual property perspective, how businesses can protect themselves.
Somebody use the I know what that really try to turn on.
No, that's fine. We can share.
Seven too many bits. So let me just start, since I'm an intellectual property lawyer, let me just kind of start with, where are we with intellectual property law and the AI? So in the patent space, you can not get patent with an AI named as your, an AI agent named as your. Same with copyright, dedicated copyright, if the AI is a free entities. Name as a creator on the, whatever child copyright. So, that's baseline for patenting copyrights, but with, patents, you can get a patent on something that's an AI related invention. you will be unsuccessful trying to get a pure algorithm to think that got this. There's certain rules that essentially shut that down, and they'll mention that. But if you use AI in a way that is beyond just trying to cut the algorithm, like first it would use with hardware to actually create something that is an invention, like perhaps using hardware in context of medicine or something like that. But it doesn't those kind of things you can recite patents. So that's where we are with patenting AI. Now, in terms of how you protect inventions that are not going to be patentable, like the trade secret is a way to do that. That's you keep your invention secret, publish it in a patent, but it's still yours if you protect it as something as secret. And if your competitor uses the same exact technology as you, then they have a problem because you assert that you know that trade secret. They've essentially unhappy. So that's just a little bit of primer on it, intellectual property and AI. Obviously, the big thing going on in the AI world related to IP is training data and whether you can train an AI model on data that you've essentially gotten from elsewhere and as well as the internet. And it's right now very much up in the air. With all of you may know that, so you can follow that, but right now very much up in the air as to whether that's going to be something that sort of the industry can do in the future. There has been a ruling recently in the District of Delaware that a competitor to a very well-established legal research company, Westlaw, which is signed to lawyers at this point, sued a startup, an AI startup that's trying to create essentially like a legal research tool that used AI. And the judge issued an order that said, since they trained on Westlaw's surrogate information, they use that to their training data set, and they compete with Westlaw, it's not fair use, and they can't use that data to train. So that's one of the first rulings that said something definitive on that kind of an issue, recently on training data. The New York Times case, which is, I'm sure some of you heard of, and some of those other big cases, there has been no definitive ruling like that in those cases yet. But one great assault in that ruling that came out about the AI startup doing, a legal research tool is that the reason the judge found that the use of another company's data for training wasn't allowed is that they were directly competing with it. So it might be a little different if the company using the training data is directly competing with them, but it's not that they're getting training data from. So that's a little background on IP and AI. There's a whole safety side of it as well, right? That's character AI. If you're not familiar with that case, that's a big lawsuit where the character AI companies make suit because a teenager took his life after interacting with the agents to the point where the teenager was overwhelmed about wanting to deal with the agent. And so that's an ongoing lawsuit, but that's more in the safety realm. And so, that area is very tricky in terms of protecting kind of yourself as a company and staying on control in a liability point of view, right? And so, I think this might come up in the Q&A afterward, but, a few things that about the sort of baseline of that kind of law is, right, if you can be liable if your product is effective. And so how do you judge what's effective? Well, that's case by case, but, it's a question of really whether your product has some kind of aspect to it that a judge or jury can find to be like a clear key sentence in how your product was designed. And if that's the case, then you could have liability. So, staying away from that by perhaps cabining the use of your product to just the intended use of the product, giving clear warnings to customers, And these are things we can talk about in Q&A session, but those are the kind of things that are relevant to trying to keep you out of trouble with using, if your product is used in a way that harms credit. Which is going to be a bigger and bigger issue as more AI agents proliferate the world. Right? And then, that's sort of the landscape. And beyond that, it's really just an open terrain at this point, right? Like in terms of whether companies are going to be able to successfully create a significant number of patents out there, IP inventions, whether they're going to be able to train that models. Like so many questions are unknown at this point. The answers are unknown because the legal, like the judges out there and the lawsuits are really in their nascent stages at this point. So there's a lot of unresolved questions. So maybe I raised more questions than I answered.
I think that's what we're going to be doing. Really on the match.
At least it's a start.
Exactly.
All right. So I pass the mic.
Of course, sharing is caring. Just for passing time. Of course. Hello, Alice. So thank you so much, Peter, for your insights. Unsurprisingly, law is complicated. So thank you for walking us through all these details and get to get into more of it in a minute. Alice, in the context of the complex legal landscape and all the things that can go wrong with AI and safety, can you tell us a little bit more about practical solutions and what model builders and enterprises implementing AI should be making it up? I can do that. Yeah.
That's right.
So first, I'm super happy to learn about the next one because, my editor is sitting in this room and saying, we'll be fine. We were on a life and the bit embarrassing, but the worst would happen, Really. So I think that's funny first. And I like the idea of maybe the problem is the human perception that is kind of slow that since that's basically the worldview. Everything that we think that happened really eventually during the very bad stuff. And we're kind of programmed, I can say from a biological perspective, to avoid thinking too much about all the bad stuff. So including when we think about AI models. And we develop things, there's no reason we should only preparing that results and push a teenager to commit suicide, but it shouldn't. So when we build AI product, we need to keep in mind there is this probability, we are biased against the risk, and we have all this liability issue that may occur, and all we develop will impact human beings. So this is the beginning of my thought process here, and I think it's nicely connecting with what I'm going to say. When we work with our customers, or where we develop AI projects at Appen, we try to be very careful, having a holistic perspective on what we're trying to achieve here. If we develop model with people, they come to us and they say, we need to gather this type of data, to structure it, to deliver this type of data. The first thing is that it happens sometimes we feel maybe we're not the best suited company to do that. And we can also say, this data is going to be your problem, right? Or this usage, maybe we can try to incubate it differently with you. So we also have this kind of like consultant posture, because we know with data we cannot choose anyone, and we know also the risk of what happened with the data. We know the risk because one part of the app is for sure to gather and to structure the gather data, but it's also to evaluate the model at the end of the process. So when we say we want to help customer building responsible AI product, it's by finding the right problem for them, to find the right data and structure the data in a way that harness the data for the model and the model for the value they want to deliver. But it's also at the end of the process of developing the model, looking with them in what is outputted by the model. And when we do that, when we design solutions for them to evaluate their model, we have to keep in mind that the worst could happen, right? So we need to ask the right question. We need to be very stringent in how we evaluate the model, and we deliver review and reports in how we test it, what resulted from this testing, etc., etc. The part of this agreement means that on some of the data can be used in training model, and so if we want to train agnostic and universal model,
and we don't have agnostic and universal data, it's going to be complicated. So, and the other thing, and I believe that's also the virtue of working with companies such as Appen. Most of the data you can kind of drop for free on the internet is basically representing a certain perception of life and perception of society, how people work, interact, what's their missions, etc. And so sometimes you need to go on the field to collect the data. You need to find people who don't express themselves on the internet because you need them paid out. And so that's where the data collection is a very complicated process. It's not an striking way. So there is something to do there. It's very tempting to decide to solve for that by using synthetic data in common process to synthesize data. You can look at the data as nodes. You can decide to create like paraphrasing to introduce variations in your data set, etc. There are very interesting papers saying that there is this type of recursive curves, saying that every time you're training data with synthetic data, the model starts drifting. So you don't want to do that because at the end of the process, you will have more risk, less accurate results, just because you didn't choose the right data from the beginning. So I think the data is a key here. And the other problem I see right now is the very, very high quality of the model's output. It's generally stunning. I think we can all agree. But if they are not correctly locked-in and they are not correctly stressed out in the test, there is a risk that we won't make the difference on the long run between what is correct, what is generated by the human wrong, but by the human, and what is generated by the model. And I think at some point also back for submission. Absolutely. Absolutely need to build on your balance that what scraping data was built on the idea that data on the web was written by human beings, and as more and more of the information that is online is AI generated, that we've all seen all AI swap blogs everywhere. If you're scraping that data, you're actually using synthetic data at that point, and it's harder and harder to discern. We've put a lot of work into building AI detection, but that's not necessarily what you're doing when you're scraping the web. So there's a lot of additional complexity to take into account there. And everyone is actually saying data science too, right? Once you do the same, but information. So when we think about dealing with these safety considerations, one of the biggest concerns is that safety practices can take time, right? So here are these suggestions with thoughts about how to pursue AI safety without hindering innovation and what that looks like.
That's the quality question.
That's my hot one question.
First of all, this is totally open question. First of all, it's actually the answers for that. So I want to say that the reason that we're talking about AI safety is basically a question of how to align the AI with the human instance. I strongly believe that that's sort of impossible because there is no approaches and we don't know what we really know. And and basically it's the algorithm that we want, the AI is sort of trying to align with how the human rational decision making, but we even do not know what is our always rational decision making is it. So I'm also thinking about maybe even though the growth of the AI is really exponential, but guaranteeing the AI safety is maybe aligning AI with how human perceives artificial grounds. Because if you also think about the fairness, and there's no broad truth about fairness, but I believe think about recommendation offers from the OP cuts. Maybe the reason why people does not raise this in the society, people does not raise the problem of fairness is not because those company actually makes really optimal algorithms. Rather than that, maybe people makes or people the researchers in the company maybe align their algorithms to satisfy how human sees. So that's what I believe. I don't know what's interest. So maybe my answer is no one is sort of trying to make aligning AI to how human perceives. Everyone is sort of considering aligning AI to make the ground truth of the human. But I truly believe that gaps might even get worse or worse if AI is just something of rubber and
with that.
more AI interactions happen. So that's why I believe actually might be answers.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, from a legal perspective, trying to encourage innovation while balancing AI safety and minimizing risk is kind of tough because we're waiting on legal, the courts to come out. We're waiting on Congress, but the House and Senate both released reports sort of looking at what the future of AI might look like and sort of how to balance protecting creators and protecting authorship while also improving innovation. They're looking at things like, AI as a useful tool for people with disabilities to go out there and create and invent and then have access to those tools, but also still make sure that people who create authorship and other things are protected. So in that regard, and from the legal perspective, we're kind of waiting for the courts to maybe come out with a rule and see how they operate.
Should I do a legal question? Okay. So I think you're all familiar with the EU AI Act. Yeah, of course. So I had the privilege to work with some of the European Parliament and the EU AI Act in the kind of like lobbying stuff that was then France Digital. It's basically a lobby consulting with French startups to discuss with them about like the regulation from the European Union. And I remember like 4 years ago being involved in different workshops. And I was there sitting with my developer, and we were working on making algorithm to match job offers and candidates. Yeah. And so we were sitting in this room and listening to this member of parliament telling us, "Oh, you're gonna have to prove where your data come from with annotating your data. You're gonna what we want you to be able to is to replay all the process for like 10 years so that we can understand how it comes from ideation to delivering your models at your red team." And we're like, "Are you kidding us? It's going to cost us so much money. We don't have a sandbox, etc., etc." Then lots of the French startups at this time, they were having the same opinion as us. And what we pushed for was having like the idea we need sandbox to experiment, meaning whenever you're experimenting and developing a model, you do it in good faith. And in good faith, you can make mistakes because you're not using the data you should have, because you don't have the right weights in your model, etc., etc. But if you can never experiment and be protected while you're experimenting, then there is no innovation that is possible. So this is why making innovation possible in the age of risk is just making sure there is like the square place where you can safely experiment and decide what can go through or what cannot. The other thing is really super pragmatic is eventually AI is something like just very fascinating. And I think that for the general audience, it's really like, it's magical. I have ChatGPT or whatever. But we are professional and we work in this industry, and this is an industry, and we invest money, we calculate return on investment. We want to like evaluate that value generated by this model. And before we invest, when we research, we need to set up a risk level we agree on, like as acceptable to develop these models. Some company will be probably bolder, some other will be probably much more on the like safe side. But I think it's something that internally in the company we have to agree on, but also within the limit of what the regulation is asking for. I know that from the European perspective, there is this on-trace approach, where it's very stringent, so it's very limitating, which is not the case with the American like tentative to regulate. It's much more like high level, etc., etc. So I think it's really at the company level, everyone needs to be very aware of the risk that the company is willing to take. What's the breasts? It's very complicated.
So I think that our panel today is already a great representation of the fact that AI safety is a very collaborative effort. It's a cross-functional initiative. We need people from all different backgrounds to be working together to try and pursue this lofty ambition of safer AI systems. Do you have any thoughts on what that collaboration can look like and how stakeholders from different industries should be working together to build safer AI systems?
It's it.
Yeah, I think that from a legal perspective, it's important to get input because the legal landscape is constantly changing. If you look at what's already happening, this is like Colorado had enacted like the Colorado AI Act, which says if you're going to have an artificial intelligence operate here that can give our users a substantial factor of information that goes into a consequential decision, which are things like education, housing, medical, legal, then your AI model has to adhere to certain transparency standards and data standards, right? And so, in the United States, you could have 50 different jurisdictions that you have to operate up here. If you look at the EUAI, like you said, they already have their own sort of standards. And then going forward, just looking at, what Congress is likely to enact, there's so much the way it goes into it. And so, getting the legal perspective there to make sure that when and if Congress decides to enact things that protect children and protect deepfakes, protect fraud and deception, that your models can consider all that. And also internally, being able to train your models with, disturbing data, like how does that work legally, right? Because you can't have some of that, on your servers, or maybe you need to be able to train your models. There's not a lot that goes into that, but somebody has to depend on models. And so getting input from legal counsel and make sure we keep up on what's going on in the legal landscape is crucial to enable these models to just be operated about it.
I'll just sum that up as consult your lawyer very frequently.
Blanket advice.
That was great answers. I like it. Well, actually, it doesn't have the answers for that, but just closing the line is, I think so. Basically, the people who make the algorithm, what they're making, what they're defining as. I mean, if you take a look at the social for making the algorithm itself, I think their ethical view or their fairness view is really important. As they will try to virtual, like definitely, but they truly including the algorithm itself, and it's if you gets horizontal learning, then you must invite multiple already stuff. So and within the perspective, actually, it was a cultivate the learners musical nets. They are going to about some open communications that they and having communications of what's right is the purest hard. Having that today. And that's I certainly purchased it. I think it's really actual. Let's have a lawyer research on your lawyer, or it's like the hardest with what you're trying to achieve, what it takes to get there, and then start with the risk management perspective and the legal perspective and the ethical perspective when you're building your product, deciding if it's worth it, if it's worth taking this type of risk, like choosing extract data, using that's data, then reactivating your model because that's just a cooking book that you never know it, and then like within outputting a recipe part. So all of this type of decision we take along the way when we develop the product, they have like an impact on when we develop. And I think it's a discussion we need to have with the entire team, with the company, just like being fair and open, the trying to brush things off, like, oh, that's a better. Same one. This one. That could go. So you go. Put a couple of counseling with your team. Yeah, absolutely. Creating iterative feedback loops and having end user feedback come back into your model and trying to grow and improve from there. It's just all of communication ultimately to try to improve over time. And before we open up to Q&A, I wanted to ask a final question, which is considering this wildly changing, fast-paced legal and ethical landscape of AI right now, do you have any final advice or thoughts for our audience?
Oh,
We found the keyboard figure out.
sorry, I'll just keep it brief. Consult your lawyer.
On the record.
I mean, that's really where we are because it's just unknown right now. So that's just an important part of the process until there's more certainty, which might not be for a while. So for the next several years, consult your lawyer. Yeah, no, but it's really true. Because things are getting figured out, and they're just not figured out yet on the legal front. So that's just the way it is. And like you said, it's a question of knowing the risks and then deciding what kind of risks you're comfortable with. Oh,
I wanted to just add to that as well. If you're not building a model, but you're using the models to help your inventions or help your authorship or like artistry as well, I think there's also an aspect of super important to document that process, just so that when it does come down to trying to convince, the United States patent and trademark office or the copyright office, if you are the inventor or you are the author, you have some documentation that shows that you actually are and what's distinguishable from what the AI model did. And I think that that's going to be a big piece going forward in order for people to be able to protect their own intellectual property and not have it, not be able to protect it. So,
And
And I'm stay constitutional like, oh yeah.
you guys were, Pledge. I have worked in a just for like 3 or 4 years, but was not really pretty interesting. You got cost over about 3% design different areas. So I truly believe to people who solely just studies line math or computer science doesn't have to indulge in really authentic or accurate understanding of what's so legal and so legal is. So also which is converges to consult with the lawyer, or I could consult with the other experts to know stuff that is the cohesive. And the answer here.
You sleep. It's like you're right. Great. Wonderful. Well, we're ready for questions. Do we miss training the second microphone?
This.
Let's see what happens. I can do some crowd work. You guys have your own way.
Perfect. Well, testing.
Look at that. Okay. Woo. I'm going to go stand over here. Decided to be standing in vertical. We're ready for questions.
That's English cell phones.
Hi, Gibel. I'd like to consult the lawyers on the matter and ask a question about open source models and kind of that role of the kind of open source movement in IP strategy. And if there's anything you guys have seen companies do or anything that's evolving now for leveraging the open source movement to help companies do this more safely and effectively, responsibly.
Could I ask you a question before I answer the question?
Yes.
So is there a specific angle on that you're probably worried about or concerned about, just to make it more specific? Or
not necessarily. I think there's a lot of conversations around, open source or closed source. And I think I'm a startup founder, right? Yeah. And as I think about my IP strategy and how I interact with, they go open or closed, what are the kind of trade-offs? And I'm just kind of interested, not specifically in my case, but kind of in your general perspective on that.
Sure. Sure. You're talking about from the model builder's perspective, how from a user wants to use the AI to make so for you. Is that right?
Yeah, from the model builder developer perspective.
Yeah. Well, certainly one downside to going open source is that you won't be able to protect any of your work with trade secret, right? There might be other aspects of your identity secret that with trade secret, but anything you put out there, public, like if you're going to go an open source route, you wouldn't be able to maintain that kind of protection over it. So that is one downside. Of course, from a technical point of view, there's arguments right about lifelong open source to really tech and that kind of stuff, which I want to address as a lawyer. But from the IP perspectives, you lose some options in terms of how you can protect your code base. So it all depends on how much that matters to you and the trade-off of any benefit you think you get from a technical perspective from making it open source. So it's not like a yes or no, but you do lose some essentially legal protection, right? You wouldn't be able to protect what you've disclosed as trade secret anymore yourselves.
Yeah.
I think it's the follow-up. Have you seen anybody navigate that successfully?
No, it's a choice. It's so I've seen companies sue each other over trade secrets. So The answer is if you think in the future it's going to be important that you
It started, I started with very open source code, and they've been like, they have a copycat in the market, which is Watchful. So they pivoted very recently to closing their code patch to avoid this type of thing because they noticed it was very like not working for them. But so that's one thing. One other thing we can add is you have the entire funding phase. Because like business model is being totally open source, so everything that you know is open source. At the beginning, OpenAI was open source, but then they closed source, and Simon Mann, who is there, just one model among many other models, like, oh, eventually open source is great. So it can also be a lever to your product strategy. Yeah, this is a product person talking. It can also be a lever in your product strategy to decide what you want to go for, and there is no, it's never definitive. You can always like change back, but what is under the open license, it's forever. There's no, you cannot reverse that. But the other piece of code, you can decide you change the model, right? Now, when we're building open source model, it's because you believe that the value of what you're building is not the code. It's the service around the way it's like offered, etc., etc.
Yes, that's good.
I thought other questions. Nice.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Isabella with the EU mission to the US working on AI policy. I was very glad to hear that EU AI mentioned, particularly because we have a very different approach to copyright with the EU copyright directive. I wanted to touch a little bit more upon the concept of fair use, as was a little bit mentioned in the panel already. But, there's been a lot of talk about synthetic data and a lot of petitioning also in the US around the government to be able to use or to be able to understand what fair use is. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about this and where do you think it's going to go?
It's a very...
Well, we might vote things. When I said consulting lawyer first, the answer is it's really, it's unanswerable in the abstract. So it's really a question that will always depend on what specifically was done in that specific case, right? Because fair use looks at, are you using it to compete in some way? Have you taken what was the starting point and transformed it in some way that's meaningful? So it's always going to be very dependent on exactly what happened in that particular situation. So it's not like a question that can be answered in the abstract. We saw already one court said if you're just taking someone else's legal summaries and inputting them for training and you're using that to compete, then that's not going to be fair use. So, that's what's called a district court. It hasn't gone up to the appeal level. And so it's, not certain if that decision will stick and stay, or get flipped and be the opposite of what that court decided. So, that gives you a little indication, though, of what to be aware of when you think about whether what you're doing is fair use, right? It's like, am I taking, data directly from a competitor and using that to build a competing product? Based on that one decision that's come out, that could be risky, but it's so early in the process of courts making decisions on this stuff that, where we are right now could be very different than where we are a year from now, because more courts are going to weigh in, and then higher up courts are going to weigh in, and they have the final say. So it's really unknown at this point. I know I didn't answer your question, but because it's somewhat unanswerable based on where we are right now in the law. But if you're making synthetic data, at least you have an argument that that's not, just taking that from someone else's source space across.
Yeah, I can maybe color the fair use a little bit because I love the fair use doctrine and more traditional artistry and analysis. It has judges trying to analyze, the artistry of things, which is hilarious. But in the case of AI and software, Peter touched on one of the factors of fair use is whether or not the work is transformative. What's the character and purpose of the use? And sort of the most traditional non-AI application to sort of wrap your head around it is the Supreme Court case about the song Pretty Woman, Pretty Woman walking down the street, that song, where the rap group Two Live Crew took it and made a parody of that song. And they said, okay, you used the copyrighted material, but you changed it. It was a parody. You're criticizing it. And so along those lines, the most traditional level of transformativeness is, are you critiquing your work? Is it for an educational use? Is it for research purposes? Which is why a lot of model builders, I think, had the ability to use copyrighted data initially as fair use because they were researching and nonprofits and things in the early stages. And then now, as Peter said, there hasn't really been any sort of rulings on fair use for AI besides the one, but it was sort of a minor ruling. In traditional sort of software concepts, there have been other sort of rulings, right? You look at the Supreme Court ruling in 2020 that was looking at Java APIs and the uses there. And they said, well, it is sort of fair use because they're taking software and they're not developing a competing product. They're making another platform entirely. You look at another case, which, they took the entire operating system and sold it as part of a security package, but it was to allow the company to sort of assess security vulnerabilities and say, yeah, you took our operating system, but you're using it for something different. And so, going forward in AI, I think that there's going to be some interesting battles relative to it is transformative, and specifically whether or not the input's transformative to training models, the output's transformative. Like there's a couple different avenues there. So I think there's some interesting work.
The question. Like, yeah, myself. Hello.
Wait, hi, my name's Onion. I'm a physician, I care. So I wanted to ask you guys, where do you think the line is? Or, you talked about copyright is, what is it, authorship and listening? What are the two for copyright? Is authorship and creative rights? Right.
You're asking about how you can get it off?
No, I'm sorry. So my question is, I think the general definition of copyright is something about college. So then when it comes to representing personal data, where is that line going, right? So if I'm wearing a Fitbit and all my heart rate and all that data is going to Google, like they only be like incented somewhere down the line versus if somebody hears me give a talk on Facebook again, my voice find markers, right? Like where is the line that you can use my data or it's not used like for an intended purpose?
Yeah. So fair disclosure, my firm represents Google, so we're not going to talk about Google. I think you can look at like few ways, right? Like terms of service matter. Sometimes, you think of an abstract question like that, but it becomes a lot less abstract sometimes in the law. Or do you just say, well, what do the terms of service say? If the terms of service of the platform you're using says that's not your information anymore, you've given it to us by being on there, then you don't have a hard argument, right? In terms of controlling after that point. So sometimes in the law, it's like it doesn't come down to big legal principles, but just what kind of terms of service are on that platform, right? So do you still own that information or not? So that's probably the answer to your question is it all depends on what you've agreed to when you used whatever you used. And then from there, it's decided by that basically, right? If you've given up control of that information, that's basically the answer to the question is it comes down to stuff like that rather than general principles of copyright law. That's my answer to that question.
Yeah, sure. There's a perspective.
Yeah,
So this is the side of the ocean. You have another side of the ocean where the law is extremely different because you're much more protected with the GDPR regulation, of course, which is a pain for a lot of tech companies, right? Because you have to, it's not only about like the angle that you're citing. It's also the fact you need to know what they're collecting data, you need to know a lot of things, you need to agree, you're uncertain reminded of that. But there is also this thing we always say product is like, if the product is free, you're the product. So if you accept by signing the term of use to be reckoned with data, then you're accepting it. There is nothing that you can do about that. What is interesting is some services, they gather data, but they've been for a very, very long time. They gather data, should you know it or not, and they will use this data to train models. Of course, I think like very recently, maybe a year ago, some people realized that LinkedIn was gathering their data from their LinkedIn profile and their post to like develop the coach. I don't remember the name, I was a coach on LinkedIn, and everyone was just like, wow, what's going on here? But they didn't realize, like, they signed up for the first time on LinkedIn like 10 years ago. It was always there. It was always saying you're doing that. Just they didn't know jobs you may be interested in, or people you may know weren't developed the same way. What's scary on people now is because you've been giving up on your data for very long to train machine learning and predictive model. Now you're giving up on data to train generative AI model. It's slightly different because the fear is you can desynthesize, you can become synthetic data, right? And I think it's equal to get scared. You see a lot of that coming. When I go to my practitioner with Kaiser, I realize that it's recording stuff. They record all the session or the discussion with the practitioner, and it's like, oh, it's to take note and to make sure I'm not missing anything. Yes, sure, I generally agree, but I know what it entails, right? And then what you can do is you can go to the HIPAA part of your file, and you can sign HIPAA to uncheck and say, I don't want you to send my data to someone else. So it stays unprotected. So I think it's a combination of a ton of like different moments when you make a decision on what you want to do with your data, right? That's also why it's super important that when we develop a model, we question where the data come from, how we acquire the data, where we want to use it. I have to read the terms of service. So package. We have time for a question and you stand correctly.
Thank
Tonight I feel like we've talked a lot about AI safety, obviously, and I feel like a lot of it is concerned with that the content was generated. It's like, for instance, you probably shouldn't be able to be copyrighted. You probably shouldn't be able to maybe generate Studio Ghibli renditions of your face. You should be able to tell us a little about things like that, right? I come from kind of like an educational background. It's something I think a lot would like to ask is kind of the vessel contextual on what the person asking is doing. For instance, if I ask how to solve an integral, I'm a scientist, probably this is my innate creativeness. If I'm asking you to solve an integral and I'm a 15-year-old in calculus, maybe that's a good thing. So I'm kind of interested in your perspective when it's like not just the content of that maybe should be generated, but also whether or not it's good, particularly for students. I think in terms of like society, like how does that change education? How to make it safe in that control?
I think that's been by your perspective.
I don't know, it's fine.
Why not? Spanish?
Disclaimer, it's not our area of the law.
Oh, man, put me on the spot already. So I don't, trying to get society to do the right thing in general is probably difficult, because what we're asking is like, how do we stop students from cheating on homework? And if teachers would figure that out, maybe our education system would be better off in general. But from a legal perspective, they haven't looked at that a lot. For example, there's some cases going on right now where they're saying, hey, your model is infringing, right? And then the model companies are going back saying the only reason our model is infringing is because you're asking it, can you please produce this book from 1979 by this author in full, right? And it's like the model itself doesn't necessarily, give you the full thing. With regards to what you're saying right now, I read Appen's paper coming into this, and I know that when you sometimes ask an AI to do something, it can, even the ChatGPT can give you some reasoning there as well, and steps in there, if I'm familiar. And so maybe from a student perspective, or an educational AI model, maybe you just, you ask it a question, it gives you step-by-step answers rather than just giving you a hint, almost like a math teacher telling you to show your work. Creating an AI kids, not dissimilar from a Netflix profile that you go on. It's like a children's profile. I think could be another way to do that. Apart from a legal perspective, I don't know the fact that
In the agents. So I think we're solving this problem right when I talked about the AI detector, we put in place to make sure that the people were inputting what were expecting. Now I'm not sure like prohibiting people from using models because it might not be relevant for a 15 years old to ask a question about integrals, because it would demonstrate that they are not putting the effort they need into learning like their math and moving to calculus. I think it's more of educational issue. And so I see two answers. The first would be, instead of imagining AI is doing stuff instead of us, I think like Hoffman-Reed, but also Diane McCoon, they all say AI is here to augment the human. So how can we leverage this model to augment the student, not in the way he would be better at like resolving integral, but in the way he would understand how it works better. And so instead of like having the answer from the model, as you said, having like maybe not the reasoning, but helping the student to learn how to resolve. That would be the first thing. The second thing, and I think it has been discussed, this is a concern also for the United Nations. I know there are like a team working on this type of thing from the education perspective. How do we make sure that we can leverage AI so that education is more accessible across the world for all the type of children, even though they are away from schools, there is no school, etc., etc. And so I believe this is an edtech problem, right? It's like, is education making sure that all alone in your room, when you're 15 years old, you can solve an integral, probably not. Maybe you need to do that in class with someone supervising you and leveraging your method to explain you how to solve this problem. So I think it's gone to other perspective, right? It's like, it's educational. How do we make sure we augment the student instead of just having the student using the model to go through the homework and just like pretend we did that or not, right? And the last piece is probably maybe what we will see, and this is more for the lawyer, maybe what we will see will be the same as for TikTok or for Instagram, teenager accounts, restriction on what the model can output or the type of question the model can answer as in your user profile. Could be essential. Then,
Yeah. I actually have started South Korea reverting with the education AI. And what I do currently, from last year, what I'm trying to do is how to teach neural network to the babies. And the reason that I believe that's possible is if you think about the integral, like you have a really complex symbol, but it's actually just combination of plus, minus, multiply, division, etc. So one of my hypotheses is that if there are any kids that could understand those four symbols, then it could even study the college math. So that's the reason why, how could you simplify all of the AI logics? And then how could I teach it to like 5 or 6 year olds? And the reason that I'm talking about, the reason that I'm talking about this is that I actually have tried this prompting to the ChatGPT, which is I want to teach neural network to the babies, and how could I make the curriculum or what you think? And here, the ChatGPT actually gives really similar answers from me, which is all the math actually comes from those four arithmetic and trying to simplify all of those complex symbols that we are familiar with to the big reference so that I know. So then the answer to your question might be, rather than prohibiting, I truly believe that utilizing AI to the education definitely revolutionize the conservative education curriculum from the government, which is at the 6th or 7th grade, you have to worry an integral and you very self-design. But I think if the education department really well utilizes those AI, and then remake the public curriculum, I truly believe that kids might have a small barrier to learn through the world as kids. So that's something I think they should.
I'd like to add to this really quick as well that I come from a linguistics research background, and education is one of the most common use cases for ChatGPT. If kids like second most common use case for ChatGPT is for help with homework. And from a linguistics perspective, that is one of the paramount reasons why red teaming is so important, because kids, as we know, are a vulnerable population. And AI has the capability and the potential to Alice's point, vastly open up the body of knowledge to children in regions and in languages that may not have access to